Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight and honor of talking with Michel Bauwens again for episode 2 of Sources of the Peer-to-Peer Theory, which I really had a wonderful time speaking before on Karl The Structures of World History. And we talked a lot there on how we have to think of the capital nation state together. We have to think about markets as not merely being a process of, say, exchange, but also a kind of psychotechnology that changes how we think about phenomenon around us. We talked about the fungibility of a Marx. How do you convince people that a cup is worth $20? What? A cup's a cup. And there has to be a kind of process of convincing people that this is plausible, thinking about kind of the sociology of a Peter Berger and all that. And what's very interesting is, for me, that all shows how when we talk about economics, you're never just talking about economics. When you talk about politics, you're never just talking about politics. You're also talking about the way that people think, how they experience reality. And nobody experiences reality as merely their opinion. It becomes authoritative, right? No one experiences a cup as worth $20 in their opinion. No, it's worth $20. It becomes a fetish, I think, is how Marx talked. It becomes very authoritative. Well, that's really weird. How in the world do you historically convince people to treat a cup like 20 bucks? And you see, and that's such a fascinating question that I really appreciated the conversation, because it helped kind of think about when we think about history, and often we think about history as merely events, one event leading to the other. But really, history is also a story of ways consciousness changes, the way that subjectivity changes, the way that we're toward the world changes. And that led perfectly into the next two books on the sources of peer-to-peer theory, which is, first off, I have The Great Transformation by Mr. Karl Polanyi. And this family is freaking amazing, because his brother is also amazing, who did personal knowledge, tactile knowledge. He was an incredible chemist, and then just on the side did philosophy that changed the world. Isn't that something? I think son or something won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, so that's something. And then Rethinking the World by Peter Pogany. That was also a fantastic read. And we also, before we started, we're talking a bit about civilizational cycles of civilization. I've already got notes on books I need to read, like Adam Smith in Beijing. That's fascinating. And just all of these different ideas of the cycles of history and civilization. So if you wouldn't mind, Michel, I'd love you to start on that, because that was amazing what you were talking about.
Okay, so first of all, I think we have to recognize there's different temporalities, not just cycles, right? So you have so mostly, we imagine traditional, people, tribal people, to have like a sort of a present that is directed towards the past. It's the ancestor worship thing, right? So there's no idea of growth, of development. It's like a permanent present, but which is, like a repetition of the past. So there are cycles, but it's the cycle of the moon and the sun and the seasons, right? Once you get in a civilizational structure, with cities and armies and states and markets, the first temporal vision is the cycle. But it's a jet-generating cycle, right? It's like life. It's something is born, it grows, matures, and dies. And that's also how they saw civilization. So, which of course is also objective, because that's exactly what happened with civilizations. And they knew that. They had all known, the Romans knew about other civilizations, and that, these were not permanent. So that's the cycle. So then you have the linear vision, which comes from Zoroaster and then the Hebrews and the Christians, which is you have beginning and an end. But be careful, this is not development yet, because it also ends in a collapse, right? And according to historians, it's really in the West in the 13th century, Joachim de Fiore, a Franciscan monk, kind of heretical Franciscan monk, who for the first time does what Eric Voegelin calls the immanentization of the eschaton. So he basically collapses the vertical into the horizontal and says there was the age of the Father, the Old Testament, the age of the Son, the New Testament, with the church and love instead of, obedience and fear. But then in the future, he says we will have the age of the Spirit, where all people will be brothers, will live like the monks live today, and we won't need the structure of the church. People will be self-disciplined in love and responsibility. And so there we get into the linear with the future orientation, right? So I think that we have to kind of synthesize those things because so there is linearity in the sense that some things get more complex over time. The world of matter, the world of life, the world of culture, and then within all those things we have complexifications and integrations. And for example, as we can see, even within civilization, that cities go from 20,000 to 1,000,000, and now it's 20 million. So over time, there is definitely a growth, and then technology is becoming more and more complex. So there is definitely linear. And then within linear, you have the cycles. So civilizations rise and fall. They have ascending peak and descending moments. And then in between cycles, you have chaos, right? And in the chaos, you have bifurcation. So it's not a progress story where you say it's always getting better. No, some things get better, but things get regularly disorganized and start anew at a higher level of integration. And I would also say it's very important to say that it doesn't have to be. You can also have disintegrations. So I'd like to give you an example. When the Roman Empire collapses, because it can no longer, grow and afford to expand and give booty to the soldiers, it has to tax internally, and it kind of starts impoverishing itself. It becomes, this kind of chaotic period after the 5th century that is not a higher level of integration. That is a dark age. It's a disintegration, right? But when you see the 15th century, you also have chaos and the religious civil wars. We get into capital state nation because of the print. So that allows the society to actually go to a higher level of complexity. And we can hope that with the meta medium that we now have, the internet, that it can also be an agent of a higher level of integration. Okay, that's so anyway, so take into account linearity, cycles, and chaos at the same time in a kind of integrated narrative. That's kind of the way I approach things. Okay, so I just want to get that out of the way. So second thing we can talk about is cycles. I spent quite some time trying to understand how they all fit together. So as far as I can see, the first cycle is actually the cycle that Karl Polanyi talks about. And sorry if we pronounce the name differently. None of us is Hungarian, so we don't really know what the real pronunciation is. But I've always thought as Polanyi, so I'll just use that. And so he's basically talking about the convergence cycle, which is a 50-year cycle within capitalism, but has been traced back at least to the Song dynasty in the 12th century in China, maybe even before now. So this is a 50-year cycle. So you have the ascending phase, peak, descending phase, and chaotic bifurcation, right? So I also want to say that chaotic bifurcation will intervene in every cycle, but at different levels of depth, right? If you have a 500 cycle, the chaotic transition will be deeper and longer than after a 50-year cycle. That will be like a little mini chaotic event, right? But the common point is you have a relatively stable system that reorganizes after a first challenge at the peak, but then actually has to completely reorganize itself when it reaches the second crisis, which is the end of the cycle, right? Okay. So the cognitive cycle is about 50 years, and so we can take an example that we all know, 45. After World War II, we get a new cycle going. We see clearly there's a peak crisis in 73. So the first half is high growth, good for labor, welfare reforms. So it's good for demand, but it's not so good for supply. So midway into that cycle, you have like a protest movement of capital, of the supply side. It says, we're not making enough money, this is not working for us. And then you have like, the conservative counter-revolution in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher, which then creates the descending cycle where growth is lower, it's good for the supply side, it's financialized, but it ends up undermining the demand side. So then you have the big systemic crisis, which is basically a political economy crisis where you need to reform. What's the management system? What's the energy system? Well, maybe even valuation system. So everything needs to change to have a new growth phase in the economy. And I think basically we'll return to it, but this is what Karl Polanyi talks about, right? He describes what he calls the lib-lab cycles, right? So the lab cycle is the ascending cycle, good for labor, and the lib cycle is the cycle, the part of the cycle is good for capital. And then each time, so 1873, 1929, 2008, right? Those are like the big systemic crises that mark an end of these political economy cycles. Then a slightly longer cycle, which is double, is what is described in the book, The Fourth Turning, right? So there you have a first generation that, it starts at the same time, 45, but there you create new democratic institutions, right? How the US creates the new world order with the United Nations and Bretton Woods agreement. So it creates like a totally new structure that's not just economical, but also like political and civic. Um, the second generation, the second turning is 68, right, which corresponds with the peak of the cognitive cycles. And what happened in 68 is that the children of this first generation already protest the way things are going. They don't like the way things are going. And the third turning is when both forces are at the same level, right? The generation of the creators is already getting older. The protesters are getting adult now, and they're both at the same level of power, and they keep each other in check. It's unstable. And then the fourth turning, which we are now in, is the chaos period, the start of because then we are really in a descending phase of this civic cycle, right? So this 100-year cycle, more or less, is also the hegemonic cycle and the war cycle. So the chaotic period of change corresponds to a big war, like every 100 years there's a big war, and a change of hegemon, right? The Portuguese, the Dutch, Britain 1, Britain 2, US. So those are the different hegemonic periods. And each hegemon has a slightly different vision of what the world order should be like. So it's power and principle. Every 100 years that changes. Okay, so these are like short cycles. Now, if we take there's a longer cycle, which is 500 and 1000. I'll try to explain that now. So look at the history of the Greek Hellenic system, which became Rome, and look at the European medieval system, which became our nation state system, right? So what we see is the emergence of a civilization, which is at first decentralized, based on city-states. These city-states end up fighting each other. That process takes about 500 years, and it ends up, when Alexander takes over, right? So the what is it? The Athenian League and the Spartan League, they have exhausted each other. So then an actor from the periphery can come in Macedonia and takes over the whole civilizational area, and eventually then the Romans take over from Macedonia. So that's a 1,000-year cycle. That's what Spengler calls a civilization cycle. Once the centralized take over, the empire starts, the imperial phase. It's another 500 years, and that's based on centralization. Now, in the West, we didn't have an empire, and some people would say it's because of the UK was always making sure that any hegemon would be eliminated. So instead, we have the nation-state system as a European empire. And, we could argue that we now are at the end of the European hegemony and European civilization. So this is the end of the second 500-year cycle, the imperial cycle of Europe, right? So that's Spengler, but also Toynbee would more or less agree with that. And so let me mention one book I read recently, which I found quite interesting. It's from Vincent Citeau. He's a French philosopher, and he has looked at the history of philosophy and intellectual thought in 8 different civilization spheres. He comes to the conclusion that there is a definite cycle of thought, which is pre-classical, classical, and post-classical. So pre-classical corresponds to the emergence of a civilization. So there is definitely like a new mythology and new religious feeling arising, and a metaphysics and vision of the world that is not coherent, a coherent spiritual vision of what society is. When a society grows, you have the cities coming online and becoming bigger and bigger, and you get philosophy. So that is reason trying to understand religion, and they're kind of the same level. And I think, Thomas Aquinas is a brilliant example of that, right? You have, he has the religious dogma, which is trying to understand from a very rational point of view. And similarly, like Plato, Aristotle, in the in Greece. But that's actually, I think, already the beginning of the post-classical. So post-classical is when reason escapes religion and mythology and becomes on its own. And I think I got that from you, Daniel, which is, this idea when you said once in one of your articles that a social system cannot be based on itself. So it's like the Gödel theorem, right? You cannot prove a mathematical system without having axioms that are not provable. And so similarly, I think we can think about a society that it needs, these axioms, these spiritual axioms, which are non-rational, in order to have reason. And then if we start reasoning outside of it, then reason becomes instrumental and starts turning on itself. And so we get like the absurdities we have today with identity politics, where, it's hyper logical and hyper rational, but it's like running on empty. There's nothing underneath it. And so that would then lead to a collapse eventually, a dark age. And then after a dark age, which you should see as a cleansing and a healing period, so Vincent Citeau says that, like in India, you have at least 2 cycles, which was the Vedic cycle and then a dark age in the middle, and then the Hindu cycle. And he does the same for China. I don't remember all the details, but it's a fascinating book, and I'm quite convinced that, he's got something there, right? So my thesis is that we are in a concatenation of those cycles, right? Which is the conjunctive cycle is ending, and we're in the chaotic period of a political economy, and we don't really have all the things ready to make it start anew. Like, biotech, AI, it's still pretty chaotic how this is going to work out. We have a civic crisis, that's the 100-year cycle. So democracy is no longer working, the legitimacy of institutions is breaking down. We have a hegemonic crisis. America is losing its hegemony, and the multipolar world is emerging. We get a split between the West and the global South. So all this that's happening, and we have definitely a danger of a big war coming between China and the US. But already we can see it in Ukraine and Gaza. It's like, we're in this chaotic period. But I think it's also the end of civilization, the end of European civilizational model. So that's a 1,000-year end of the whole European cycle, but it's also the 500-year end of the European Empire. I want to go deeper, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but probably you'll agree, I think. So are we, in fact, or not, at the end of civilization itself? So I want to make a little argument here, right? So tribal, kinship-based societies, they actually are also relatively, sometimes overusing their resources, because, like when the natives came from Asia to America, the big mammals died out. So there's definitely, even in Neolithic, there was already, a cycle going on of over extracting. And there is a study called Human and Nature Dynamics, which shows that from the Neolithic onwards, there is already. But civilization definitely up to double level and changed the relationship, to civilization, a relation between agriculture and cities based on extraction, based on conquest, and based on a mastery of nature. The tribal did not master nature, they live with it. But definitely the civilization wants to master nature. And so we could ask also the question, isn't that the model now that is in danger? That is, that we need to find a higher level partnership with nature and the world of life. And that is probably not civilization anymore. That's something else. Add to that, the translocal, internet-based self-organization at the non-geographic level, and we have, again, something that transcends the geographic nature of civilization. Okay, so that's kind of to build the big picture, and I think Polanyi, is, of course, concentrating on a small part of it, which is the cycles within capitalist society, right? And the dynamic between market and state. So the lip period for Polanyi is when the market frees itself from society and the state weakens, and you get theories like, let's say, fairless ALA, where the state is not supposed to intervene in the market. The market eventually creates too much inequality, creates chaos, breaks the social contract. You get the reaction, right? And that ushers in a new cycle and a new lab period. So start of the cycle, high growth, good for labor, peak crisis, LIP takes over from lab, LIP financializes, creates more freedom in the market, but at the cost of balance of society. You get a deeper crisis, a reorganization of productive system, and again, labor is stronger. I think that's broadly what Karl Polanyi describes. The emergence of industrial capitalism at the end of the 18th century, and he shows how the monarchy, was it a Tudor monarchy, still cared for the people. They had a basic income, the spin hand lamp system, where in every parish you had a solidarity mechanism, And capitalism emerges by breaking that social contract, voting the corn laws, the labor laws, which gives a pure market system which is a catastrophe for labor, right? They start dying at 35, the enclosures, the farmers are disenfranchised from their land, but it allows capitalism to grow. So that's kind of the essence of Karl Polanyi, and why he's interesting, because he shows the market state and the liberal labor dynamic within capitalism. But to be honest, I think we are getting outside of that, right? I think that capital and labor, that's within capitalism, but we now have immersion post-capitalism, and that's between commoners and the rentiers of the platform capitalists. So this is more like a 300-year, 250-year change, at least, like a new form of capitalism for the moment, right? Where so the contradiction, and I think the two layers coexist. I'm not saying labor and capital do not longer exist. They exist. They're still very important, but something else and something new is growing within it that is already like prefigurative of something that is fundamentally different.
Magnificent, everything you said. And any difference in pronunciation of name, you're right. I can just tell you right now I'm wrong, just with the Virginia accent and different
I
things.
have
So
no
that's
idea.
quite good. Second, everything, you're on the linear, the cycle, and everything you're saying reminds me of a part at the end of this one where he's talking about the Fitzgerald intelligence, where he says something like, for Fitzgerald, being intelligent is the ability to accept two contradictory ideas and still function, as that kind of being dialectical. And there's something about, wait, how can there be a cycle to history, but also progress? Well, these are contradictory ideas, and that's being able to think that is necessary for functioning. And actually, to this point you were making on reason or rationality, is rationality, as I would describe it, and this goes to what you were saying, to the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, some people call it the counter-enlightenment, some people critique that notion, Hartman, and what they all kind of basically warn is that rationality that does not have to observe a common life, that separates from it, like you were saying, it totalizes. And when it totalizes, it tends to become totalitarian, and it becomes a power structure and causes all sorts of pathologies. And David Hume was all over this. And that's why he also notes, funny enough, at the beginning of the Treatise of Human Nature, is that rationality that doesn't have to honor a common life or a non-rationality enters something he calls philosophical melancholia, which is basically, in my opinion, another term for the meaning crisis or nihilism. Because what ends up happening is reason, by its own premises, is able to lift you out of an embeddedness, as Karl Polanyi talks about. And this is where capital and the logic of autonomous rationality, as I call it, go together. And once it does so, you don't have any ground for your life. All you have is your thoughts. And you see thinking just goes on and on and on and on. And you can always, the skeptic can always find problems with things. But here's the issue. If you're separated from your embeddedness, and then you have to make a choice on how you're going to live your life, since you can always find reason not to do X versus Y, because nothing is perfect, then you never re-embed. And when you're not able to re-embed, you're more susceptible to manipulation by power, by the market, by all of these different things. In a way, I think, to kind of think about the cycles you're describing, is that it seems to be a tendency of history for reason to separate itself from an embeddedness, leads to a totality, which then in this book with Peter, that would be the stable state that is entropic. Once you enter that entropic state, the only way to break through it is chaos. And then once you have the chaos, you enter the fourth turning. And I think you did a wonderful job. I really do think quite highly of Generations by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which the fourth turning is based on. And I think looking at that book as a process, as a movement of rationality into its separation from embeddedness, leading to totality that then leads to an entropy, that then leads to a new kind of chaos and a transitional period, that describes very well. In the $1 million question, well, what ends up happening, in my opinion, is we lose sight of that cycle, because there's something about technology that gets better, not because we're necessarily smarter, but because of trial and error. Like, technology is a product of having more time to screw up. And so the longer humanity doesn't nuke itself, you could say, the more there's a natural increase of technological progress. But we interpret that as evidence that rationality doesn't need non-rationality. This is the problem. The very irony is that the tendency of technology to advance by trial and error functions as evidence to us that rationality doesn't need embeddedness, actually. That the more you unlock rationality or markets, look, we get all this great technology. Isn't this evidence that rationality doesn't need non-rationality? And so you keep making the mistake over and over and over again.
I see what is happening now with identity politics as exactly that. It's based on, first of all, on gaming. I really think this is based on gaming. So you have a whole generation that has socialized online, and they have avatars. And in the game, everybody has to respect your identity as an avatar, a self-chosen identity. And this is now becoming the ideology of, the trans identity movement, right? It's like, I am what I say I am, and you have to recognize me in the real world. So it's like an imaginary world has taken over the physical world. And transhumanism then adds up to that, which is the idea that our ideas can transform our body, right? We think that, well, if you want to change gender, we'll just do it by surgery and chemicals, and you'll correspond to the image you have in your head, right? For me, this is like a double disembodiment of disembodiment that is like typical of an end time of rationality, where the rationality turns on itself and is not able to to ground itself in the real.
I think that's a brilliant association. I think, the term I use is it becomes auto-cannibalistic. It means it eats itself, auto-cannibalistic.
Yeah.
Another term is self-effacing. I think Zizek has a lovely part where he talks about people finding their true self on video games. And I think that's a very interesting association, their true self, quote unquote. Because, Chad Haig has an interesting thought where he talks about how the metaphors by which we understand history tend to be shaped by the energy or the way that we do food. So if we're in an agricultural society, we tend to be more prone to think in terms of cycles because of the agricultural process.
Yeah, of course,
but if we use gasoline, we're more likely to fall into a mistaken notion of progress that doesn't honor the cycles. And it makes me think of what you're saying about video games, because the more and more you are using a kind of I am what I customize, then that metaphorically changes your way of seeing the world to think that everything doesn't need embeddedness, that everything. And I think the point of connecting that with transhumanism is very good. It makes me think of Nick Land. And what Nick Land wants to argue is that AI or transhumanism and all that, and I think it fits with Karl Polanyi. If Polanyi, I'm trying to say it better now, Polanyi, if there's a logic of capitalism that is fundamentally a unembeddedness, pulling out of common life, well, then if capital does that, and the more capital leads to then digital, video game, AI, what you see is AI is kind of the supreme crown jewel of a rationality that doesn't need any embeddedness, a pure autonomous rationality that doesn't have to embed in anything. But if we look at Peter's book, that's a rationality that precisely gives you what? A stable state, an entropic stable state. So what you're doing is if you're going to then use AI, say, to replace human intelligence, you're going to almost by definition have it be thinking according to an intelligence that's going to probably be more auto-cannibalistic. Now, that's not to say it can't be used, but it would have to be used with human beings in a relationship, just like the environment. And here's the key. The human would have to be the source of non-rationality in that partnership. It would have to be the source of embeddedness, but in order to make sure that the AI, which is going to be a more autonomous rationality, a less embedded intelligence, doesn't lead to entropy. But here's the problem. We use our tools and then our tools make us, right? Like we use capital and then capital make us. The very act of using AI, and Viveki has talked about this, makes us then go, well, that's true intelligence. I need to think more like that. Therefore, we begin thinking more like the AI, which is the exact wrong way to think, because that almost guarantees the stable state.
Yes. And, I have this, I'm a digital curator, and I'm noticing more and more people, like they take what I'm talking about. They put it in a machine, and then they feed back to me what the AI has said,
Yeah.
as if that was a higher intelligence.
Yeah.
They really assume that there's this. So like we would consult a wise person before, and they consult AI in the same way, as if it represents a higher intelligence than us. So I think maybe I want to say a few things about Pogany, Peter Pogany, who. So I think he proceeds in the following way. So we have three levels of reality. The physical world, right? So Pogany is one of the first, or maybe not, but he really stresses the necessary change, from monetary capitalistic ways of thinking towards biophysical ways of thinking, right? We have to think of ecology is in command, not the economy. Economy is derivative from the ecology. So he stresses that we live in a isolated system where, yes, we get energy from the sun, which we can only partially metabolize, but we don't get matter. So we are not in an infinite system. We are in terms of matter, we are a self-enclosed system. And when we use matter, we degrade it. So we are, in this inevitable entropic cycle. And so that means that we really have to think about living in balance with the earth over a very, very long term. So that's like, I think, a first point. Then he looks at the second level, which is, human social organization. So basically, he calls himself a new historical materialism. And he looks how societies deal with this material reality, how we transform, matter and energy into things that we need. But then this is very important. He crucially also integrates a third level, which is what you said in the beginning of our conversation, which is the human mode of consciousness, because we have a participatory reality in which, depending on our structure of consciousness, we actually see the world differently. And so I think what he describes is, you have an ecological challenge and a societal response, but which is linked to a particular way of viewing the world, right? So I think this is, and so Pogany uses Jean Gebser, who looks at the evolution of consciousness as a series of complexifications. So you have archaic, magical, mythological, and rational. In each of these broad phases of consciousness structure, you have again an ascending line when that mode of consciousness is actually solving the issue. So you have a challenge, a physical challenge, and this particular mode of consciousness deals with that challenge. So, for example, you go on the hunt in a tribal era, and of course still people living that way. You use magic to have empathy for the animal and to identify with the animal, and therefore you can see and hear and feel things that you otherwise wouldn't feel, and you put yourself in a mental state where you can go on the hunt. So magic works very well, to solve the issues of that type of society. But then you start, in the negative phase, you start using magic to harm people you don't like. You do black magic, and okay, same with mythology, and same with reason, right? So reason had an ascending line where we're actually solving problems, but now we're in the degenerative phase of the rationality. And so what Gebser then says is that the next stage is integral. And it's a very complex notion, and I maybe not be able to explain everything and even understand it. But the way I see, because this is actually what I try to do with you when I talked about time, right? So an integral consciousness is able to use all the previous modalities appropriately. So you transfer it to yourself. You know when you're doing magic, you know when you're doing mythology, you know when you're doing reason, and you know how to apply them in the right context from a meta integration point of view. And so that's Gebser, the ever-present origin, which I think is a very important book, which corresponds to the work of Ken Wilber and Aurobindo and all these people that studied the evolution of human consciousness as a series of complexifying stages. What Pogany does is the integration of the three levels. Biophysical economics, Marx for mode of production, and then Gebser for mode of consciousness, which is something the Marxists never did. They see the superstructure as derivative, and that's not what Gebser does. So Gebser might actually be more like a historical idealist, right? Where the mode of consciousness is determining, and Pogany, I think he leaves it open. He's a true integrative thinker. He doesn't say this determines this. He looks at how they all kind of determine each other. And so I think Peter Pogany is a very good author to understand the limits of our planet, how we have historically adapted to the material challenges, and how, as you said, that it does not happen without chaos, right? You cannot step from one logic to another without going to the disorganization phase first. And that's where Pogany is a difficult author, because he believes that the next phase, the next transition will be very, very painful, which I agree with. And because the concatenation of cycles means the same thing. Each cycle requires its own solution. It's like an agenda for the political economy, an agenda for civic institutions, an agenda for dealing with nature, and an agenda, so, and all these things are now like happening at the same time.
No, that's magnificent, and a few things come to mind. First off, I think that was really well put. I think what you mentioned on Gesper, I always like Jeremy Johnson's work on him, and I think with me on integral, one of the reasons I emphasize, to me, that notion of integral is suggesting the possibility of, if we know that rationality has this tendency to become auto-cannibalistic, could that knowledge actually help us put it in its proper bounds, or to transform the metaphoric structure? In that sense, there might be a possibility of progress, and a kind of ironic move of realizing that we're not naturally progressive per se, that we naturally, according to what we think is best, end up in a very bad situation. And one of the reasons why I personally emphasize non-rationality as a term, because I think language and metaphors matter, just like we're saying we tend to associate with AI. I'm of the opinion that the way to possibly progress, almost in a Hegelian sense, from these horrific cycles that seem to just over and over again lead to a totality that is entropic and chaos and so forth and so on, is something that's bordering on irrationality, but it's actually non-rationality because it cannot be rationally calculated. It's precisely what I call the Gödel point. We talked about Gödel's incompleteness. It is precisely the point where rationality has to acknowledge, oh, we can't complete ourselves. We're relying on axioms outside the system. Is it possible that history reaches a point where it runs out of plausible deniability, that it isn't ultimately reliant on something non-rational? To me, that's the integral point, as I understand it. Now, again, I use the language of non-rationality because my concern is often when people talk about consciousness, elevating consciousness, I know exactly what they mean, but we've been so trained by the school system to metaphorically associate consciousness with rationality and unembeddedness following the capitalist market, that I find it's hard for us to hear that language and not actually have it fit into the trajectory of rationality toward totalization that becomes auto-cannibalistic. So that's just a language matter. And for me, when we emphasize, well, the key here to the integral is non-rational, Well, what in the world is that? It is something of which is intelligible, but not according to the system of rationality. It is like, smell is intelligible. Like if I were to ask you how is smell rational or any kind of qualia or different things, I might be able to rationally arrive at an explanation for the existence of the qualia, but the experience of it as intelligible requires experience. And by definition, that is embeddedness. Because if we follow Karl Polanyi, so much of the problem of markets that lead to totalization, rather under capital or the capital nation state, capital, etc., is a loss of embeddedness. Well, that goes back to the Scottish Enlightenment. That goes back to the counter Enlightenment. And how do you counter that? Please, please.
And well, so I'm thinking different things, but one of the things that is assumed by transhumanists and accelerationists, and is that we need more progress, right? And I think in a sense is the opposite. It's like we need regression in the service of the ego, as it were, but at a society level, we're at a point where we actually have to go back to our bodies and to agriculture and to our connection with the wild. We have to reintegrate, right? And that's what integral also means. It's not just a mental thing; it's also physical things. And so, second remark is that I do think that when we live, right, determines like how we think. So when we're in a progress point, we tend to think progress is infinite. But now that we're in decline phase, I think that the danger is that we think, we're going to collapse and we will never come out of it, right? And so I think there's two types of transcendence. There's a horizontal, a vertical transcendence, which is your spirituality, which is your ability to detach yourself from the material world and find peace in some kind of internal state. And I'm not particularly good at that. So but there's also, I think, a form of horizontal transcendence, which is if you have the capacity to see beyond the cycle, right? Because if you're in a descending phase and you only see the descending phase, that's really like a recipe to be very, very despondent. But if you can see the seed forms that prepare the next cycle, and you can project yourself far enough, right? And so I think we need a combination of verticality and metaphysical certainty, but also we need, and that's the kind of work I'm trying to do, with my more limited capacities to have this narrative for social change. So one more thing, Pogany, he talks about global systems, right? So global system zero was the cycle of mercantilism before industrial capitalism. And that ended, this is what he called the chaotic transition, with the Napoleonic War. That then the system bifurcated to what he calls the Smithian system, which is the industrialization phase. And there he says we have weak multilateralism. Oh, we have no multilateralism, sorry. So it's only alliances between countries, which eventually to World War I, because that was a mechanic effect of these alliances promising to help each other in time of crisis. So then we have, so the chaotic transition is then World War I and World War II. And that creates global system 2 after World War II, which is a social contract within the West between capital and labor, weak multilateralism, but at the cost of the global South and nature. And so then the next phase after the current chaotic transition for Polanyi is one, extending the social contract to all the people of the world, have basic food and shelter and health guarantees for everyone on the planet. And second, a new contract with nature. So extending the social contract to the world of life, to the preservation of life. And I think that's a quite a pragmatic and very healthy approach to like what is our program today. And I think that's it. We need enough social justice to come out of this chaotic social struggle, and then we need long-term ecological balance. And so this is a contradiction that I'm not out of this, but in a way, and I think you hinted at it, in some way we now need to get out of the cycles, right? The cycle of destruction of we need some kind of steady state physical system. And what that will mean for the cycles, I'm not sure. It will be expressed differently, but the kind of destructive cycles of extraction of destruction is what we can no longer afford, right?
Magnificent. So for me, like one of the reasons why it becomes incredibly important to show that rationality unembedded or without non-rationality eats itself is because that makes it then in a way, if you know that's what rationality does in a funny way, that negates sublate rationality and makes it rational to have a new contract with nature. Like if rationality is aware that it entails a fundamental limit, then that actually in a weird way changes what is rational and suddenly makes a contract with nature rational, right? It changes the social contract. But what's interesting is the question is, it's almost like, if I'm being a bit of a Hegelian for a moment, it's almost like we're at the moment of history. And I'm not saying I necessarily know this for sure. There's something about this moment of history that seems to be where rationality is in a position to recognize its own essential limits and therefore negate sublate rationality to make it rational to acknowledge those limits, because the stakes of not doing so are very dire, like too dire, right? And also we have enough technology information to actually be able to look at history, to see all of these different things, to get an awareness of the cycles, to have a sense of how they operate. Because to me, the cycles, which I think you are correct, there are cycles, the cycles are somewhat a reflection, Heidegger called it the forgetting of origin in a way, of the tendency of rationality to convince itself that rationality equals best. And so the more rational we are, the better we are. Like it's progress. Yes. Like the more unembedded rationality is, then the more progressive it is. And whatever happens is throughout history, over and over again, we're able to naturally convince ourselves of that just by experience. Like you just see, oh my gosh, we're able to like travel the ocean now. Oh my gosh, we have the internet. There's also a natural tendency, it seems, and it goes to your video game comment that was so good. There's some natural tendency in how the human brain, dare I say, tends to experience reality that convinces us that freedom is freedom from versus freedom with. So what I mean by that is we tend to go, oh, if I'm free from my biology, I'm freer. Or if I'm free to choose my biology, I'm freer. Well, going to someone like Hegel, freedom is actually found in freedom before, where you find freedom in, where you don't try to free yourself from something, but you identify with these determinations and learn how to play them like a musical instrument almost. Please.
Well, that's basically why I think the cycles are important, in the sense that we can only be free, truly free, if we know our determinism.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you have an illusory freedom. You think you're free, but you're determined by the zeitgeist.
That's right.
Right? And so you're progressive because you think there will always be progress, but actually the zeitgeist is telling you that.
Yes.
It seems like that. But if you take a longer view, you know that progress will end. There will be a declining phase. And if you're like us in a declining phase, we have to know, well, we won't always be in declining phase. We can prepare the next phase of ascent.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, well, I think that idea of identifying with the determination, again, for me, the way I talk about it with the philosophy of right, is that you have to freely choose your determination or your determinism to turn it into the necessity that makes possible your freedom. Because in a really funny way, the only thing that's free is nothing. The moment there's a something, there's a restriction, right? Like the moment you come into existence. So there's no such thing as freedom that is not defined within determination, right? But there's something about the human brain that is able to believe that, well, I'm able to let me put it this way, rationality is more dreamlike than we realize. And what I mean by that is in a dream, you can imagine anything. You could be wherever you want. Rationality is not bound by anything necessarily if you don't choose to bind it by your common life and non-rationality. Therefore, it is able to create the impression of the possibility of a freedom that doesn't need determination or embeddedness. And then it experiences technology or its own self as evidence that this premise is true. And so then it acts on it. So then it creates technology and capital. And then that just seems to repeat over and over again, creating the cycles. Please.
Yeah. And I think technology, and I actually need to wrap up because I have another meeting.
I just enjoy speaking with you so much. I know. Yes, sir.
Is that, what I think happened is, so we use technology to escape material reality. So when the West stopped believing in transcendence, in spiritual transcendence, in the vertical dimension, we collapsed our hopes and dreams of escape determinisms. We collapsed it in the horizontal. And so what transhumanism is trying to do is to achieve spiritual transcendence in the physical world. And it's a category error. We can't do it, but we believe we can. And by location and all of that. So like there's I forgot his name, but there's an Indian scholar, or at least a Hindu scholar, that he mapped out the 64 powers of yoga cities to technology. And he said, for every city, the power that we can obtain through meditation, according to the Hindu tradition, we are now building a technology to do it in the material world. And so that's an unconscious religion, which is much more dangerous than a conscious religion, because they are not aware of the non-rational. They're not aware of the premises that drive their rationality. And I think this is, like a work we have to do, is to examine what are the non-rational premises that we have in ourselves that drive us. And I have that in my own experience, is that I think I have a good rationality, but I also know it always derives from my basic emotional choice. That, like, who do I like and dislike will in a quite a serious way influence who I want to listen to and not listen to. And I don't claim I can escape it, and that's why we need intersubjectivity to challenge ourselves and to, the way I see it is, we have an object that we can't fully grasp, but by shedding light on it from different perspectives, we can increase our understanding of it, right? I mean, that's kind of why. But I think so. We have to be subjective, objective, right? Intersubjective, interobjective at the same time. That's why I like the integral approach of Peter Pogany.
No, that's magnificent. And I don't know where the time goes. And just as a final thought to what you're saying, I think the truth is all rationality is based on a non-rationality, whether it knows it or not. The question is, does it acknowledge it? If we don't acknowledge it, we're stuck in the cycles. But if we acknowledge it, that's where I get into with Cadell on psychoanalysis, desire, subconscious, because then you have to confront the real of your non-rational basis, which is very hard. But basically, if we don't do it, we're going to end up in these crises. So there's something about the psychoanalytical that is part of this. I think the metaphor, I'm thinking more and more like this new society. I completely agree with you. It's something like a garden. Matt Segal has talked about that with Whitehead and all of those. Tribal, it's now something like a garden that is designed. It's not wilderness. There's a design, but it's a designing of nature. So there's something about technology in that metaphor that comes together. I think also, I just wanted to note, I like Karl Polanyi, because if indeed markets were created, then the idea that we just need to get to the free market, then we'll be more rational, or we need to oppose capitalism and we'll be more rational. Both of those myths gets kind of taken out, and then it becomes an unfolding of consciousness. Please.
One little remark, but we can talk about it another time, which is, so I was reading Adam Smith in Beijing. It's based on the work of Brodel, Wallerstein in the World Systems Analysis School, and they make a very important distinction between the market and capitalism. And so Adam Smith in Beijing is a very interesting book, because he claims that until the 18th century, China was still predominant, but it had a market development. And he says, and Adam Smith is a theorist of the market, not of capitalism, and Marx is a theorist of capitalism. So the West went industrial capitalism, the East kind of collapsed. But what they did after, what's his name, Deng Xiaoping, is that they reconnected with their market development, which is industrious and not industrial. So they use a lot of labor rather than capital, and so they can give everybody a job, etc., etc. So okay, we can't talk about it today because of time considerations, but it's and Polanyi says the same, right? Polanyi stresses that the market can be very different, whether it's lab or lib, embedded or not in society. And I think capitalism tends to disembed embodiment, but we can have embodied markets. Anyway.
No, that's magnificent. I'll have to read the book because I love that distinction. And no, it seems in closing that what we need almost is a science of non-rationality. We need a non-rationality. Otherwise, we can't have a relation. We're going to have a totality. And that's going to cause the entropic. And that gets in, non-rationality gets into emotions, aesthetics, subconscious relations, all of those. And the last thing that's
So I wonder if Zach Stein's new book, it's called First Values and First Principles, is not kind of related to what you just said, like an attempt to create a new non-rational ground for a planetary society. So
I love that Stein. I mean, the value, I mean, I've been talking with Jockin about beauty and Aristotle and value ethics and all that, because that's all central to this.
It's really, really good. And so there's another author which I need to explore, which is David Chapman. On meta-rationality, and his website is meaningless.com. He also makes a lot of interesting distinctions.
Well, that sounds right.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you didn't. Well, and as a final point, I promise, is that my dear friend Lorenzo does work with collective consciousness and game theory like Nash equilibrium. What he finds is that you basically cannot escape, whether it be a Kenneth Arrow public choice problem, I know he mentions at the end, you can't escape it unless you introduce neurodiversity, which would be like Down syndrome or people who think differently, like a Simone Weil I associate and belonging again to. Until you do that, you can't escape Nash equilibrium. A way to look at all this is basically what's being said is planetarily, unless we introduce non-rationality to the collective consciousness, you're going to end up in great, great trouble. And I think, Lorenzo models that. And that's the commons as well.
Okay, just an anecdote, but, like in Tibetans, right, in their religion, they would always introduce like a seer, like, right? Someone who spoke directly from the gods. And I think maybe that was a non-rational they wanted.
Absolutely it was.
To make sure that...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the meta, Layman and Mr. Pascal has talked about meta shamanism. There's this notion of Bonita Roy, all these different things. That's exactly in it. And you introduce that to the collective consciousness. If you do not do that, you cannot overcome all of these Nash equilibria, public choice, et cetera, so forth. Here's the problem. Right now, because we're not intentional about our non-rationale, the system selects for sociopaths, people who don't have empathy, and they become the CEOs and leaders because the system still needs the non-rational. We're just not aware of it. So it selects for people that have the worst characteristics.
Okay, we could talk for hours. I just want to say that I think that the traditional societies after the eggshell age, right? You had the priests and the warriors, right? The warriors were necessary to defend the territory against people who would enslave you and exploit you. But then they would behave the same way with their own population. And so you needed the priests to elevate and compensate the warrior ethic. And we're missing that now.
Yeah.
We had a state in a way that tried to compensate the market. And then the capitalist market escaped, to this transnational financial thing. And we have no mechanism, and that's where my work comes in with the planetary commons, with the magisterium of the commons. But that's, again, it's another discussion.
No, I mean, we threw away religion like a Chesterton's fence, not really realizing that it was a source of non-rationality for the collective consciousness. And now we're at the mercy of an unrestricted autonomous rationality in the form of capital that leads to AI, like Mr. Nick Lamb says. Michel Bauwens, it is always a pleasure. I always enjoy it, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And onwards to episode number 3.
Yes, sir. I look forward to it. Thank you, Michel Bauwens. It's always a delight. Have a good one. Best to you, sir.